Good evening and welcome to our podcast Tuesday night. It is 7 on the dot, and we are glad you're joining us. If you're taking the time to join us after the fact, thanks for taking the time to watch or listen to our podcast. And we really do genuinely appreciate everybody that joins in. And if you're joining live, as always, we do open the chat for questions or comments. And tonight, the topic is, do I really have a soul? And I think there are many directions I could take this, but to just kind of zoom into some of the thought on the soul in general, I was actually researching for something else, and I was legitimately trying to study the Victorian age. And it stemmed from a comment made about a Ouija board, and so I was looking up kind of the origins of the Ouija board and stuff like that. And so anyway, but during the Victorian age is actually when the Ouija board was made popular, actually commercialized is probably the right term. And it was interesting because the Victorian age was, obviously the name Victoria is because of Queen Victoria. During the early 1800s, she was made queen, and she reigned for 60 plus years. And she was apparently a pretty devout believer in Jesus. She was an Anglican Protestant, but based on a lot of her journal entries and stuff like that, she had a genuine faith or experience with God. And I don't know all the details of her religion, for lack of a better term, but I do understand that she was a very moral woman, and she was very modest, and she inspired a culture of that same level of modesty and acknowledgement of God, which is where the whole like wedding dress look came from, and men wore suits and ties, and they covered most of their skin and stuff like that. And it really was an age of genuine modesty and piety. Men and women were attending church more. There was a lot of moral reform. Bars were shut down. There was a lot of conscious thought about God, and there were a lot of things were rising at that time. The 1800s is a very interesting time, especially in the Christian realm. But something also interesting happened during that time is the rise of the conflict between science and faith, or Christianity more specifically. And so during this time, the early 1800s, geologists started making these claims that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old, and there was we're actually millions of years old. And so they started, the whole carbon dating thing started coming into play. They started aging the Earth, and then Darwin's the book is always escaping me. I was gonna say Theory of Relativity. That's not him. Origin of the Species. Yeah. So he published that book, and on day one, I didn't know this, but on day one, it sold out. And that was a major flashpoint. Mid 1800s. This is during the Victorian era. Is a major flashpoint for the culture, because people all of a sudden started doubting whether there even was a God. And all of a sudden, science started playing a big role in people's minds. Oh, well, maybe the Bible isn't true. Maybe the Genesis story is actually not factual, and there are all these conflicts coming into play. And then all of a sudden, the rise of the adopting of alternatives started taking place a lot. And so you got to try and picture this era of modesty and church attendance and Bible reading and prayer, and this stuff was very, again, for lack of a better term, popular. And it was happening. People were doing it. People were adopting it. People were getting converted. Rise of many, many famous preachers during this time as well. But then all of a sudden, there was like this seed of doubt. Not all of a sudden. It was over a period of years. But this seed of doubt started getting planted in people's minds. And all of a sudden, people started doing things like adopting spirituality, which is spiritualism. Sorry, not spirituality. Spiritualism, which was like mediums and seances. The Ouija board came out, which actually apparently a lot of this came from the United States and was adopted by the UK. And so the Victorian era essentially started to die. And then Queen Victoria dies, and I think it was Edward that took the throne. Is that correct? King Edward? I think it was
I'm
King
not.
Edward.
I'm not sure of
I can't
the
remember who took over
timeline.
after his, but anyway, I think it was Edward. So another king is there, and
Yeah.
he's not as
No, he didn't want to be king.
yeah. So there was a lot. All of a sudden, there's political turmoil happening, and then people started just splitting away from the church. And the reason why I share all that is because it was like this point where people felt an accountability to God. There was, the Methodist movement was very big then, and so what would kind of be like in that time, like the relative version of Pentecostalism was probably back then. Like the revivalist movement was very Methodist, and there was a lot of conversions. There were revivals happening during that time. So then all of a sudden there was like this turn, and people started blatantly choosing alternatives to God and what we could call traditional Christianity. And so the reason again why I say that is because it was almost like there was a moment where people thought my soul, and one day I'm going to stand before God and I'm accountable for how I treat my soul, to all of a sudden, maybe this isn't the route, and maybe what I do doesn't matter as much. And so people started adopting these alternatives, and that gave a rise. This is actually during the time of the early industrial boom, and so the pursuit of wealth started taking a very heavy toll on this, once very moral and very God-driven, culture. All of a sudden started to just dissipate, essentially. And so it wasn't as cultural, and that actually that continued. That school of thought has continued and even progressed in many different pockets of the world, and it still exists today. And so atheism is still very, very prominent,
Yeah.
and there's spirituality has led into progressivism and what do they call it, free thinking,
Yeah.
and a lot of that still exists today. And so there is now a school of thought, two schools of thought that I want to talk about tonight. Is one is that man doesn't actually even have a soul, and that came from a lot of the Darwinistic thinking and teachings, and then the rejection of the Bible as a truth at all. And so people started just saying, well, man doesn't have a soul, God doesn't exist. There's no meaning to life, there's no purpose, and what I do here on earth is not going to have any impact on what happens after I die. And then there's another school of thought, which is very interesting and honestly very common among even Christians, is that even though they believe they have a soul, many people don't live like it matters. And so they live in such a way that it's like, well, my soul's not really that important, essentially. They don't give a lot of thought to it. And so it's kind of the school of thought of thoughtlessness.
Mm.
And so I was thinking about that, thinking about scriptures that were running through my mind. And one, two quick scriptures. One is Jesus gives this parable, and he's warning men against greed. And he talks about a man who had, his crops bore a bunch of fruit, and he became very wealthy. He says, what am I going to do? I have so many goods, or I have so much grain. What am I going to do with all these goods? I'll just tear down my barns, build bigger ones, store all my grain and my goods, and then I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And then in verse 20, he says, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and these things you have prepared, whose will they be? And so it highlights not only a man who didn't put any thought at all towards his soul. He's just living
Yeah.
for, right now in his comfort for this life, and kind of some of the stuff we talked about last week. But also the fact that there's clearly a consequence for that way of thinking. And then Jesus says in Matthew 16:26, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul?
Yeah.
And so all of that to say this, or to ask this, is what is a soul and why does it matter? And those aren't direct questions for right this second, but again, there is a school of thought that does believe man actually doesn't have a soul. I could even quote the movements or the groups that actually have a name, and so there's few of them. But that's an interesting thought to me. A man not having a soul. So how do you describe it? Somebody says, what? Do we even have a soul? How would you answer that, and how would you define what a soul is?
Well, I go by I think that the most wise advice that anybody could ever give is the idea, just that, the real issue when it comes to these kinds of things, and it's always, I always see this, and as you're mentioning all this, it just rises again. Is that, it's complexity. It's make when you make things real complicated, then you can prove whatever you want,
Mm.
because complexity breeds confusion. and
Interesting.
and so that's what you see when you look at that. You look at, because the first thing, when you mentioned about the whole idea of the introduction of the Ouija board and how society began to adopt this, and the timing of it, and all of that, the first thought that came into my mind is, well, that shows you the state that the church was in at the time.
Mm.
It's a reflection of the church at the time, as the church obviously was losing influence.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why the church loses influence, when it has influence and then it loses influence, is because there has been a loss of the core reality of what church is and why it's there. So for people to start thinking, well, what if there is no God? As Christians, to do that, it says either one of two things: one, you never knew the truth,
Yeah.
or you've lost it. You've lost the truth. But either way, somehow along the way, you have abandoned truth. You've abandoned reality, and you are looking for an alternative to reality. And that really is what religion is, what atheism is in general. Is these are all alternatives to reality, because it's a very telling thought if you think about it. So here's this, at first century, Jesus is giving this parable of the rich fool, but he has enough goods, and his reaction to that, to having accomplished, gotten to the point. Okay, I've worked hard. I've got a lot of stuff. Okay, so I'm taken care of. My needs are taken care of. I'm done with that now. Now what am I going to do? His thought is not about being industrious. He's already been industrious. He's built an empire for himself, basically. And so, but now he's done. And so it's not like there's a momentum of industry. Well, let me go do something even greater, with my life. No, what's his motivation? His motivation is, I'm going to take it easy.
Mm-hmm.
I want to coast the rest of my life. And so now we're looking at what I would call the foundation of humanity. And that is what happens, and if you think about that period of time, like you talked about it, it's a time of industry, it's a time of productivity. The 1800s, where things are moving along. You've got, the United States is established. You've got, all kinds of things that have happened during that period of time, and but you have this piety is probably the way of describing it. Where there's a religious sympathy,
Reverence, or
reverence for the things of God, and being a gentleman was being, you were called a Christian. He's a real Christian man, and so there was a lot of respect for these kinds of things. But you can see what's happening is the idea is people's needs are being met, and now they want to play,
Mm.
And so now, out comes the Ouija board and Darwin, origin of species, and all these things are coming out. They're to play with, and you might go, oh, no, this is science, and, this is progress and all. No, it's not science, and it's not progress. It's a reason to play. There is no purpose in life. That, for all intents and purposes, that really is the momentum behind atheism, is there's no reason or purpose to life. Now that's the main tenet. The main tenet is not atheism is the alternate to God, and a productive universe, and a meaningful universe. It's not another way of being meaningful, or another way of being productive. It's an anti-meaning, anti-productive. It goes the other direction, which is the nature of man. Is that's what we want. Is we want to have our needs met, and then we want to play. And that really is the the sum total of the life of most, if not all, people. And so when you talk about the idea of having a soul, the proof of having a soul is just simply the fact that we know that that's wrong. you know, Animals do just that. They build dams or nests or whatever, and take care of their young, and pretty much goof off. There's not really a whole lot going on in their lives. And so, and they do that naturally. But we don't. Why don't we do that? Why don't we by nature do that? Just meet our needs and just, function off of what do you call
Instinct.
it? Yeah, just instinct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for, actually. Yeah, just functioning off of instinct. Why don't we just run off of instincts and nothing else? Why do we think? Why do we want to know the beyond? Why do we want to
help me understand the difference there, because I've heard people say that, oh, we're all just creatures of instinct, and so we just
But that's
function
not
off our
true.
basic instincts.
Yeah, that's not true as a human, because we are far more able to think and process and go against instinct, and so that's just a
Well, give me an example of that. Give me an example of like having an instinct and then going against it because there's something else going on.
any type of morality whatsoever, is not instinctive. That's a code. Instinctive would be, what do you need to do to survive? That would be instinctive. What is necessary? And there are many things that are not necessary, and not everything we do. The whole concept of survival of the fittest, to me, is funny, because it seems to be the, quote, discovery of a principle that nobody does anymore. It's the Neanderthal man. It's way back, in history, and we've discovered this history. And the irony of that is that we've written that history based on the theory of evolution. It's not because we've observed any of these things. It hasn't. None of this has been observed. The idea, the transitional forms and all these kinds. These are arguments and debates that will always go on, and the issue is always the same: is we have these things, but they're from the past. Well, how come we don't have any from the present? Oh, well, there's a reason. And it's like, if we were talking about just reasonable thinking, then we wouldn't have to make excuses to prop up theories and ideas. We would be able to just have the evidence right before us for any of those things. And so when it comes to the idea of having a soul, is the idea that we're even debating these things at all. We wouldn't be debating these things if we didn't have a soul. Why would we? Why would there be a debate? That's the thought that's always running through my mind when it comes to these kinds of conversations is just that. The idea of, why are we thinking about things that we have no raw material to think about? We don't. We have raw material to think about it, and that's why we think about it. And the fact that we're thinking about it is proof of its existence. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we think about God, is proof of his existence, because we wouldn't be thinking about something that they have no raw material to even think about. There would be no reason to think about that kind of a thing. I can't give you an example of things that would be things that we don't think about because they don't exist, because
we don't think about it.
We don't think about it. Yeah, we don't think about it.
I actually was rolling through different things, and
you can't do that, because they're not there. The idea, the concepts, even in fantasy, the concepts of fantasy are based on a reality that we struggle with. It's a reality, literally, that we struggle with. The idea of a spirit realm, Is a thing that we struggle with the reality of it. But that really is that is where fantasy finds its license, to function,
Yeah.
is out of that. This isn't just coming out of the non-material fantasies of people's minds. With all J.R.R. Tolkien wrote a great uh, thesis on fantasy and the idea of fantasy. And what was interesting about it is his conclusion is that fantasy is so marvelous, the way that it, the castles and kingdoms and happily ever afters and all that kind of stuff, is because it's true. That's the reality, is that it's true. It's all true. One day, you know, uh, we're going to enter into eternity, and fantasy will be reality. And that was J.R.R. Tolkien's kind of take on it. And it's like, but it makes perfect sense, because it's the whole idea of something that we think about, because there's a truth in it. We have the Bible. We have the stories of the Bible. You may struggle with it, and you may struggle with it. It's reality. I think it's hilarious that we can struggle with the reality of things that are happening in the Bible that don't happen anymore today, but yet we don't seem to have that problem when it has to do with evolution. Things
Yeah.
that don't happen anymore today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, no, it did happen back then. Yeah, because we have a bone, or a tooth, something like that. And it's like, no, that's plenty of evidence. You can build a whole person off of a chip of a tooth. It's like, okay, all right, you can live there if you like.
Yeah, that was actually one of those funny. I wish I had a picture. We could put the picture up, but when we went to the exploratorium, do you remember the evolution map they had?
Yeah.
And then they talked about how the evidence of this doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
They're talking about like all evidence is virtually completely wiped out.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
so why do we still believe it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. So okay, so but help me like maybe make this very very basic. Is what is the soul? How do you explain what the soul is?
Well, like other parts of us, they're the immaterial part of us, which again, that's another factor altogether of the idea of a realm, beyond the material realm. Is that we are not just material beings. There's lots of immaterial, things we don't understand about how we function. We understand a lot about how we function. We've discovered a lot, through experimentation, and science has taken us through that. Science that is not in opposition to Scripture. There was never an opposition to any of these concepts and ideas in Scripture. They may have been, in various religious denominations, but Scripture never did. Otherwise, we would have the Bible, the New Edition, after it's been tailored, for the discovery of all the scientific things that we didn't know back then when the Bible was first written. But there is no such thing. That doesn't exist. And the reason that doesn't exist is because science is a subset of the Bible. It is not a replacement or a higher learning or anything like that. It's not like the Bible is like, grade school and science is university or something like that. That it doesn't function like that. One doesn't pretend to define the other, or to even to regulate the other. They're not. That's not the case. And so when it comes to the idea of having a soul, it's the, like I said, it's the immaterial part of us. It's the basis of who we are. That's the thing I think is so ironic about it, is that there isn't a single person that doesn't know this, intuitively, because it's not even a thing you have to have an education to understand. You just know by the mere fact that you think, and that you have ideas and thoughts, especially when you have ideas and thoughts that invade, who you are. they're not coming out of who you are. Sometimes you get ideas, crazy, weird ideas, and you think, man, that didn't come from me. That came from somewhere else. And you're right, it did come from somewhere else. It didn't just come out of the spontaneity of chemical reactions in your brain, and triggered this hallucination that became a thought, that became a this or that. It's trying to explain things that way is silly. I think it's just basic and silly. And what I was getting at, and I kind of shifted away from that, is the idea of simplifying. You just have to simplify this stuff. The reality that we have thoughts that don't originate with us, and the fact that we have some sort of stand on those kinds of thoughts and ideas. That's the workings of the soul, the mind. The biblical term of it, and the definition of the word soul, the idea is the functioning of the intellect, of mind, emotions, and will is the actual idea of the soul, or the definition of a soul. Is the soul is the seat of the thoughts, emotions, and will.
Okay. So there's a question that's come up, and I'll ask that, and then we'll kind of want to continue on that thought, thinking about the interaction with the soul. Okay, the question is, I encounter people who don't believe in God but still believe there's a higher power, pointing towards human nature's tendency to worship or believe in something.
Yes.
Is the, I think he's talking about the disparity between believing and worshiping a specific God, but is this because of spiritual blindness, or is this like a willful rebellion?
Well, that kind of ties back to that whole idea, of all that has come, the whole Nietzsche God is dead, which is funny because he wasn't, when he said that, he wasn't saying that in some sort of victorious
Statement.
way. He was saying it from the standpoint of, we're in trouble now. If God is dead, we're in trouble because we have no framework for anything anymore. Because he understood, even though he wasn't a believer in God, he did understand the necessity for a belief in God, which is ironic, because if it's necessary for us to believe in God, then God has to exist in order for it to be effective. Otherwise, what are we doing? We're just lying to ourselves. And so that idea, of what I was saying in the beginning, is the fact that we want to play. And so, it is a measure of deception that's associated with it. It's the idea that when it comes right down to it, and it's something that I've thought a lot about, especially in the last several months, of a couple of instances of things, of this idea of the definition for some people, not everybody, and thankfully not everybody, because if it did, we'd be living in a really weird world. But that the freedom for some people is the ability to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's real freedom. And that is, if that concept was a reality, we'd be living in a real messed up world.
Yeah.
Because doing whatever you want means being selfish. That's what it means. And being selfish means hurting other people. Because you cannot, there will always be times in life where you'll have to make a decision to forego your own person in order to help somebody else. And if freedom is the ability to do whatever you want, then you'll never do that. And so that means that there will be lots of collisions in life between what you want to do, or what not what you want to do, but what you are going to do, and other people. There are going to be lots of collisions along the way. And the truth is that is the reality. Yes, many people live like that.
Yeah.
Their life is just one train wreck, and they're just constantly colliding with life, because they want to do what they want. And it doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. So there is I would say that's the idea of somebody wanting to believe in a higher power is just a way of excusing away the reality, I think, of accountability to a specific God. You know, that idea is that there's this supernatural creative force in the world that has created us and has gone away and has left us to play. I like using these kinds of terms. I know they're offensive to people, but I like using them because it forces you to have to think about the reality of the thing. But it's the idea that God built the playground and then went away to let the children play. And that's what you're looking at when you look at somebody who believes in a higher power, but they won't define it as God, a creator God, or a God that requires accountability. That's the idea? Is this is the God that created the big playground, and then went away and left you to play in it.
So, I actually looked up that quote where when you said God is dead. It's interesting that you said the way that you played that out. He actually said, so I was trying to figure out what direction did he think that would take, and it says that he was quoting that, like you said,
Yeah.
not from the standpoint of making this like emphatic statement.
Yeah.
God's dead, guys. Let's get over it with.
Right.
It,
Yeah.
No, he was actually afraid that would cause a collapse in the moral
Yeah.
framework that kept things safe.
Yeah.
And he said that it would lead to nihilism, which is basically like everybody does whatever they want.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting concept.
Which is like I said, that idea, of freedom.
Yeah.
At being nihilism.
Yeah.
Thankfully, there's not a lot of people that sign on to that, because if it did, like what he says, and see the fear of nihilism, that can only occur in an intelligent mind, because otherwise, if you're not extrapolating the consequences of these things, see, because you may like the idea of God not existing, but what does that mean in terms of reality and its effect on reality? Not just its effect on humanity, but its effect on reality as a whole. How does that change things? Well, it obviously makes things worse, not better.
Yeah.
So for God to not exist makes things worse.
Just say that outright. Why does it make it better and not worse? Like, why does the concern of, there being a God who you're accountable to, and, a soul that you're going to stand before a God one day, why is that so important, and why does it make things safe or unsafe, or favorable or unfavorable?
Well, for the very same reason that some, not all, children become adults. Because for a child to become an adult, they have to pass through they have to get the revelation of accountability. That even though they're on this planet, and it's interesting, you look at the stages of a child's development, and it's just undeniable the necessity for a child to actually understand the idea of accountability and consequences. Kids play, and I remember that my daughter told me about a situation with one of the kids that was a friend of hers kid, had picked up this toy. He's looking around. He knows this is a bad idea. He's picked up this huge toy. It's like a vacuum cleaner. He's picked it up over his head, and he is about to club this little baby, with this.
I know this story.
And,
The kid on the floor was my kid.
So if you think about what's going on in his mind is, I wonder what's going to happen. He's not thinking about what's going to happen. He doesn't understand consequences. He doesn't understand physics. He doesn't understand that he may kill this kid. He's looking at this and he's thinking, I wonder what will happen when I do this. And there's almost a level of excitement to do it so you can see, what's going to happen. And so that's why kids need parents, and I'm like my daughter said, she spends most of the day keeping the kids from killing each other, because they're, at that time, when they were all younger, at that time, it was all, what if I do this? What will happen when I do this?
Yeah. The
You
crazy
know,
thing is, it's not even malicious.
no,
It's not
no,
like a.
no. It's just what will happen. What will be the outcome? It's part of the development process. Your brain is putting together bits and pieces. And so if you don't teach your kid, the importance of restraining those things, then he will end up killing somebody. That will be the outcome, even if he didn't intend on doing it. He will, because as his opportunity for an even more dangerous environment, begins to become available to him. If he hasn't learned those ideas of restraint and accountability, and what if I do this has to become, this may be bad, maybe I shouldn't do it at all. I mean, you have to start developing an idea, an understanding of good and bad, and so that is so critical to development. And so, rolling back all that is the idea, that's why this is important. That's why, God and the reality of God is an absolute necessity to a world as it is. The world, if there was no God, the world would be different than it is right now. In fact, it would be, if we would just be honest about it, it would be non-existent.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't be, because it's been created. The world has been created. Everything in it has been created. There is nothing that was here that's just always been here. The idea, the concept right there should be enough for sober-minded people to take, a moment, and think very seriously, rather than to discard that as the one little thing that gets in the way of this whole series of truth. It's like, no, that one little thing says this is a lie. It's not the thing that gets in the way of the truth. It's the thing that proves that this is a lie. So,
Mom's job: keep the kids alive for another day. It's coming. It's coming.
Yeah.
I actually remember that pretty specifically as well. That the kid with the vacuum. He contemplated that. That was premeditated.
Yeah.
I watched him back
Yeah.
up toward the kid, look around.
Yeah. I know this
Full
isn't
fake vacuum.
I know this isn't a good idea. I know there's something wrong with this.
Yeah.
But
And that's the interesting thing, is that there's something in him that's like, I need to do this when nobody's looking.
that's called a soul. Yeah, that's called a soul.
That's very interesting. So actually, that leads perfectly into my next question. There's a scripture that's always fascinated me in the Bible. Every time I read it and every time I think about it,
But before we leave that,
Go,
I
right.
think it's important to say that that's the immaterial. How do you?
Yeah.
That's not a material thing. There's nothing material about that, but it's very necessary.
Yeah.
But it is immaterial.
Yeah. So this is still actually relevant to that.
Yeah.
But Psalm 43 verse 5, he says, "Why, my soul, are you downcast?" So just stopping right there, this guy is having a conversation with his soul.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me. He's like looking at himself, and he's talking to his soul, and he says, "Why are you disturbed within me?"
Yeah.
And so, tell me a bit about
So there's an interesting
the interaction.
question. Yeah, there's an interesting question. Who's doing the talking?
Yeah, that's actually a
If-
question I had.
Yeah, if he's talking to his soul, then who's doing the talking?
Yeah.
And the reality is that you can't make those kinds of distinctions, because it is the person reflecting on the person. It's a wonderful concept. It's the thing I've talked about this many
I
times
was just
before.
going to ask, is that the idea of being self-aware?
Yeah, but many times before that I've talked about this idea.
Yeah.
See, animals don't do that. Plants don't do that. They don't sit there and talk about themselves. And why am I the way I am? And maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should try to walk on two legs instead of four. It's not. It's just not. It's not. It's not. It doesn't go there. And I know that there are animal lovers that like to pretend that they do, and that's fine. It's cute. It's a very cute thing. But
You don't actually believe that, do you?
but it's a Well, I mean it from the standpoint of, oh, isn't that cute? They believe
Okay.
that they actually believe that flowers like
It's sarcastic.
it's like
cute.
how you it's
You
like
didn't
how
say
you
that
are.
like you normally say
It's
something
like
sarcastically.
how you do. It's like how what you do when you little kids, are pretending they have a imaginary friend.
Yeah.
It's the same
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
idea. It's cute, but
It's a little creepy sometimes, to be honest.
the idea, of being able to be able to it's the I've talked about it, like I said, I talked about it before. You read about it in the Bible of the prodigal son who's left his father. He's made a stupid decision. He's asked his father to give him his inheritance now while his dad is still alive. And he goes out because he wants a head start in life. That's the idea. Is like he wants a head start. He wants to go out. He says, I don't want to, basically, I don't want to wait until you die to start my life. I want to start my life right now. But he doesn't have the maturity to be able to do that, and so he squanders it all. He wastes everything. But in the middle of all that, in all the stupid decisions, he's able to have a chat with himself, and he does the same thing. Like, why are you? Why are you cast down? That same idea. Why am I here? Working for a pig farmer when I could be at home. And that isn't just working out logic. That's looking at things and being able to evaluate your like why are you cast down? They're having a pep talk with your soul. I could go home and I could make this all work. And you could try if you like, you can try to dissect that down and say, no, this is just the mind working out its options. That's all it is. It's a singular mind working out its options, and that's all it is. It's just looking at everything in terms of its options. Well, but what's motivating that mind to look for options? And that's another factor that has to be included in there. So, no, it's still the mind. It's the mind coming up with this on its, yes, but what is motivating all this to happen? You're now going in a direction by thinking that way that goes away from discovery. It goes to, because the ultimate thing is we don't know why this happens. We just know that it happens this way, and that's it. And so we don't need to go any further with it. But if you want to discover, you need to look deeper at the circumstances rather than writing off possibilities. And so the idea of this soul, why are you cast down? I have had conversations like that. I doubt very seriously if anybody listening has never had conversations like that. Because you have conversations like that, and when you're in the middle of that conversation, it's like there's more than one person involved. It is not like this linear, okay, I've got to come up with a way of fixing my life, and how do I do? No, there's argument going on. There's confusion. There's difficulty. There are all kinds of factors that are involved in this, and you're sifting through all of this stuff, and you're parallel processing things. It's not just this linear from A to B to C to D, and so that idea, of a soul. It fits right into all of that, because you're not just trying to find the logically best decision to make. You're trying to, like if you think about those words, soul, why are you cast down? Well, if you're the kind of person that thrives off of, living out bummers, then your words aren't going to be, soul, why are you cast down? Your words are going to be, this is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having the time of my life. But people don't do that. They don't, when they're living in misery, they don't have that kind of thinking where they think I'm having the time of my life. But it's interesting when you hear the inner conversation from people like that, and you start realizing, this happens to you a lot. In fact, it happens like every day, and it's ever since I've known you, kind of a thing, but yet there's a thinking process that's going on, and things are being processed and all those kinds of things. But down underneath that, there's somebody who doesn't even have a voice that is actually the one running the show, and he loves the chaos, and so that's your soul. There's your soul. So the soul, why are you cast down within me? Well, that's the logic, trying to work through. But what's the soul's response? It's going to be different in different people.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, it's going to be, hey, you know what? Yeah, you're right. I need to believe God. I need to. Others is going to be, screw that God stuff and all that. I'm going to just do my thing, and I don't care, if things don't work out the way that they should or not. So my point being in all that is, this is more than just, when we're talking about the soul, we're talking about the idea of the soul. This is more than just, uh, trying to understand the what is a linear thinking process. We're getting in heavy and deep here, and I want to try to get back in the shallows, but the idea, that thought, soul, why are you cast down within me? That's a legitimate conversation that everybody has. It's not that's not something that can be you can try to explain it away with science and behavioral ideas and things like that, and it's really, when it all comes down to it, it's just that. But the fact is that reality says otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Reality says otherwise, and that's why we have such a need in our modern, highly intelligent world for therapists. Is because we need to. It's becoming more difficult to untangle our thinking, because our thinking is not just this linear process of A, B, C, D. There's all kinds of things that happen all at once in our thinking. And who we are plays into that very. So you have who we are, you have what you've experienced, all these kinds of ideas and thoughts that all play into who we are, and they are what influence the soul, where the soul is. The guy, the rich guy, in the Bible, he's, I'll say to my soul, he's soul, you have worked hard, now eat, drink, and be merry, and that whole idea is he's trying to convince his soul of something. He's trying to transform his soul. He's trying to move his soul into another realm, and that's what Jesus is talking about when he says, "What will a man give in exchange for his soul?" Is that idea of that, because there is a soul, there is a sort of base of who we are, but that we can bargain that away.
Mm-hmm. So that's, again, a perfect lead into my next question. So we've talked generally about the soul.
Yeah.
We've talked about what I've kind of just put down as the present interaction with the soul.
Yeah.
Now, take me through the care of the soul, and what is the motivating factor there? Because, clearly this guy's decisions that he was making on a regular basis, however, we don't have a time span here, but he's obviously gone through and planted his crops. He's reaped a harvest, a very, very, very large harvest, and now he's actually making plans for the future, and he's going to tear down his barns, build bigger ones, and then he's going to be able to just take it easy. And so in his mind, and even in his interaction in present with his soul, this is good. This is the direction to go. But God comes down.
Well, no, I wouldn't quite go as far as to say that his soul is in agreement with this.
No, that's not what I'm saying. He in his mind, his interaction with his soul is, this is a good thing now. This is the good direction to go, right? Yeah. So that's how he's treated his soul.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of, you could even say he's laid it on his soul. This is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And so, but God says, you've been a fool.
Yeah.
And so up to this point, you've made foolish decisions.
Yeah.
And your soul is going to be required of you. And so now that's again, there's the consequence element there. But so what is, so let's say that this guy, was to think more consciously about how his soul is going to, end up somewhere, or in this case, is going to be held accountable. He's going to be held accountable for how he treated his soul. Yeah. What is the proper way to care
I think
for
we
your
need
soul?
I think we need to kind of clarify a couple of things there, that that the idea. So in Genesis, when it talks about God creating man, it says He took him, you know, out of the dust of the ground, fashioned him. And that's the body. And then He breathed into him the breath of life. That's the spirit, and man became a living soul. And so the body and the spirit are the components, but the soul is the product. That's the end product, is the soul. And so why that's important to start there is the soul is going to be the thing that lives forever. And how you treat your soul is everything. What is it that you are letting be the leader? The body, which was created from the dust and is going to go back to the dust, or the spirit, which is the breath of life that came from God Himself. And so when God created us, He created us to be for the soul to be dependent on the spirit for life. Because the body was just created, the body was fashioned, the body is the tent or the house, or like if you're making something, it's the
Vessel,
shell,
bowl,
it's
yeah.
the container.
Yeah,
It's
container,
not
that's a good one.
the valuable part of the thing. You buy something and it comes in a box. The box is, you can discard the box. The thing is what you're after. And so when it comes to the body's like that. It's just a box. It's just a container. It's the thing itself. Even though it is interactive, with the soul and spirit, it's still just a container that we're one day going to discard. And that's going to be discarded, and we're going to get a new container. But that new container is going to be different, but still the soul remains the same. The spirit obviously remains the same, but that's the life of God in us. That will of course remain the same, but that's just a component. It's not the thing itself. The thing itself is the soul. And so when the Bible talks about because he says, what if you gain the world and lose your soul? And then he says, or what will you give in exchange for your soul? Is the idea is you're giving away, you're discarding you. It'd be like, you get, Amazon, the package comes and you open the package and you reach in, and the thing that you ordered, you throw that away, and then you keep all the packaging. And it's like, this sucks. I mean, it's, I this is all I get. What about, I just paid $50 for this. It's like, well, no, you threw away the thing that was the important thing. And so that's the understanding we need to have of the soul, is the understanding that is the important thing. It's the real you. It's the you who you are. And that soul depends on the Spirit of God. And it's housed in the body. And so you have to understand that. There needs to be a respect for that. So this is one of the problems with things like atheism and religion and being success oriented and all the things. The Bible points all these things out. Is that the idea is that the soul without the spirit is nothing. It's just nothing. The soul without the body, well, that's not a big deal. It's because the body does express the physical interaction. It's how we interact with the material world, but it isn't who we are. It's not the same. I know it's hard to maybe fathom that concept or that idea, but a soul without a spirit is worse off than a soul without a body. And yet that's what most of us are. It's just souls without a body, or with a body. Sorry, a soul with a body, not without. And so the idea is, we're a soul with a body and no spirit. And that's a worse situation to be in.
So, what is the? So you talk, because it feels like you kind of mentioned more like the concern for the soul. Like, what is the act of caring for your soul?
Well, yeah, the act of caring for your soul is um, facilitating uh, interaction with the spirit.
Mhm.
You know, and this is the interesting thing. You So when I became a Christian, or actually before I became a Christian, the night that I went to church, I went as not a Christian. The idea of doing what those people were doing, I thought, I can never do this. I could never sing and clap, lift my hands, close my eyes, have these moments of, intimacy with something I can't see. All those things, was like, I could never do this. There's no way I could ever be like this. And that was, for me, the most difficult, I'd say, the most difficult hurdle of becoming a Christian is I could never be one. The idea of acting like a Christian, I could never do that part. The idea of, interacting, like I said, interacting with an invisible being. It's just the whole idea of that was just too much that night. But the funny thing is it was so easy to do that once my eyes were open to the truth that God existed. It was like, this isn't hard at all. There's nothing hard about it. In fact, I wanted to. There was a preference. I watch, during service, people will come in, visitors will come in. And it's amazing how many people can just sit there. I mean, they just, like they're at a movie, that they don't like, and they're just there, looking around, taking everything in. But yet it's not for them. You can see it's not for them. And then you never, over the years, I've discovered this, is you never know what kind of conversation you're going to have with them. What's going to come out of the conversation. I've had people say, yeah, no, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any of this. I just came because I was invited by a friend, or, I just decided I would come, and I've been thinking about it, the idea, but I don't know, I'm still, and all the way up to, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. And it's like, how can you be a Christian and not have no desire to interact with God, who's the whole reason why we're here, and it's funny to me, the whole thing it's very funny to me, because it doesn't make any sense. Really, when it comes right down to it, it doesn't make any sense logically. I pretend I'm an alien from another planet a lot. That's kind of why I have these kinds of thoughts, about these kinds of things, is because it's like, if I was an alien from another planet and I'm just simply wanting to understand, why people do what they do, what kind of questions would I be asking? What would be the things I'd be looking at? And that's one of the, why come to church and you're going to just sit there? You're not going to respond to anything. You're going to go home, and I know we're probably not going to see you again, or we're probably at least not going to see you regularly,
Yeah.
because you're just not into this, and so, okay, fine, you're not into it, but what are you doing to find out about that, or why you're not into it? Why have you just come up with this conclusion that, oh, I'm not into it, so I'm not going to do anything with it? And so now you're what are you going to do? You have no relationship with the God who created you. You have no desire for a relationship with the God who created you. You're just going to sell your soul to the lowest bidder, to anybody who offers. It's sad, because that's what ends up happening, is that, usually people like that, that's what they do, is they end up just selling themselves for nothing,
So it's interesting because uh, in all three of the scriptures we've talked about so far, and the rich fool, which Jesus calls a rich fool, he says, so it will be with any man who stores up for himself and is not rich toward God.
Yeah.
And then Jesus, when he says, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul, he's saying that directly connected to saying, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Other writers or other of the Gospels say, deny himself daily.
Yeah.
So they actually use the word daily. And then conversation, or the conversation with, the psalmist and his soul. He says, hope in God.
Yeah.
And so there are these very practical, things that are
Yeah.
being pointed out
Yeah.
here. They're not like mysterious.
No. No.
They're not even necessarily that deep. They
Yeah.
can be. They
Yeah.
are, and when you get to know them a little bit deeper. But they are also very, very face value.
Yeah.
There's not a ton to that. And so, what do you think is like the what do you think is like a big hang up for people when it comes to properly caring for your soul? What is the thing that's like a
Honestly, it's funny you say it that way, because that's a softball throw to me, because it's exactly what I was thinking about, and I'm going to hit this out of the park. Because there's been services where, I'm not happy with the circumstances, the material circumstances going on around me, but I'm not I'm not I'm not a material being. I'm a soul. I have a soul that needs to be in contact with his creator. And there's I don't there's no connection between what I'm going through in this material world and my relationship with God. They're divorced from each other. They're not related to each other. I'm not trying to, to take that thought too far, that the two don't tangle. But the idea, like, I come into church, and the idea of just sitting in church and not worshiping, it's just never. It's just never. It's never who especially worship. Especially worship. It's funny over the years, because I've had lots of opportunities over the years to work with different people, and they become like, sound technicians, or they're running stuff in the church, or they're ushers or whatever, and it's interesting to me how many people actually, they like being involved in those kinds of environment, or those kinds of things, simply because they get a pass for not worshiping. It's like, I used to hate doing parking lot duty. I hated it. It was like, what's the point of me even being here? I have to sit out in the parking lot. I can't worship. I can't sing. I can't do anything. I got to just sit out here in the parking lot and watch these stupid cars, because we were having problems with people breaking the cars during services. And so I had to go out there as an usher in my rotation. And it was like, I dreaded going to church those nights, because like, this sucks. And I would sneak around the side of the building just to hear the worship, and just sit there and just worship. Is like, I'm not here to watch stupid cars, But I know people that they would volunteer to watch the cars just so they don't have to be in the service and worship God. And it's like, it's not a thing I can identify with, because what are you doing to your soul? That if you can sit in church and have no desire to worship because you don't like what's going on around you, you are more selfish than you really understand. You really have literally made yourself a god. You are God, when you function like that. Because if you are in right relationship with God, then it doesn't matter what's going on in the world around you. You will want to worship God. You will want to be in his presence. You will want to get close to him. You will want all those things. They're not, the two are not related to each other at all.
Yeah. Interesting. So now, how important is the soul?
How important is the soul? It is who you are. So it isn't, you aren't anything without it, and so to discard your soul is to discard who you are. And like I said, you'll just sell yourself cheap, and I know from personal experience what that's like, because I wasn't always a Christian. I wasn't raised as a Christian, and I had the potential to do things with my life that I squandered, and ended up within a very short period of time in the whole party scene, simply because I was just going with the flow of my lower nature, and had I not been rescued by the truth, that I was a soul, and that I had a creator who not only created me but loved me, and was willing to do everything possible to bring me into relationship with himself. I can't imagine I can't imagine ever being at a place in my life where that can be, you know, negotiable. It's just like you can't be any more selfish. I just think about, because I know people, there are people in my mind when I'm saying this, and I think these people, they think they're generous. These are people, they'll give money to things, they will give you stuff, and that makes them feel good about themselves. That's why they do it. They do it because I think so they can look in the mirror and go, "You are amazing. You gave money to this person. You did this. You did that. You sacrificed this. You did that because you are so awesome. You are so wonderful." But yet they can walk out on God. They can just tell God, "Get lost," and well, maybe I'll come back to the church sometime in the future. Or I'm going to go to a church that where I don't have to be as involved, or whatever, and where there's no, where people don't expect me to do things, that kind of, it's like you're just, when you can turn salvation into a selfish endeavor, you are fantastically selfish. There's no two ways about it. You are amazingly selfish, beyond what ordinary people, selfish people, can become. You have become extremely, amazingly selfish.
So, the answer to the question tonight, do you really have a soul, is yes.
Yeah, absolutely, you do.
All right, that's it for tonight, and we appreciate you guys joining. And again, if you're joining after the fact, we really do genuinely appreciate you guys taking the time to watch or listen to the podcast. We do this every Tuesday night, and so we encourage you, join us again next week. If you're in the local area, come and check out a church service. We will be here tomorrow night in person, and our doors open an hour before every service for prayer. And so you can find more about our schedule and events online. We do have a concert this weekend, Saturday night at 7 o'clock here at the church building. Again, the address and everything will be on your screen here in just a second. But we do appreciate you guys joining tonight. Look forward to another podcast next week.